Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Technological Solutions, Potentials and Limitations. My name is Zareen Karazian, and I am Associate Editor at the DFR Lab. I'm joined today by 4 experts who have been at the forefront of designing and deploying emerging technologies within broader efforts to create better functioning information ecosystems. They are going to help us critically assess some of the tech-centered approaches, figure out where the hype is, and figure out where the potential lies in empowering people on the front lines of disinformation campaigns. Evanna, who is partner and CEO of Omelas, a technology company that uses data analytics to map how state and state-adjacent actors manipulate the web to achieve geopolitical goals. Sam Gregory is program director at Witness, an international nonprofit that helps people use video and participatory tech to defend human rights. Allan Cheboi is Senior Investigations Manager at Code for Africa, Africa's largest network of civic tech and open data labs building democratic solutions. And Maddox is an adjunct professor in the Department of Information Sciences and Technology at George Mason University and Chief Technology Advisor to the US State Department's Global Engagement Center. He works on building the US's technological defenses to disinformation campaigns. Evanna, I want to start off with you as the founder of a tech company in this space. Disinformation is a fundamentally human phenomenon that has been around since people have been able to communicate with one another. But over the past few years, there's been this emerging industry of companies proposing tech-centered solutions to detect and counter information manipulation. What is driving this market interest, and what problems are these companies trying to address?
That's a great question. Thanks for having me on. I think ultimately the marketplace is really driven by the fact that with the advent of very cheap AI and data and the just massive amount of data out there, computational propaganda has made the disinformation space a lot more critical in terms of national security, but also in terms of our human rights and civic education. And so there are a lot of companies out there that are trying to tackle this, this problem. And really there's not a single, there's not a silver bullet, right? And there's not a full stack solution that can do everything and tackle the entire problem. And so you have a lot of companies out there that specialize in one niche aspect of the issue, which basically means that now we have an integration problem. So if I am the GEC and I'm trying to find a couple of solutions that can help me solve an ultimate problem, how do I make sure that the tech stacks can actually talk to each other? And how do I also make sure that it is done in a way that is efficient and that actually helps protect civil liberties and data privacy concerns? That's sort of the future challenges of the marketplace.
It's an interesting point about the integration issue. And JD, I want to turn to you for your thoughts on that from your work with the GEC.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me as a representative of the GEC. This is a great group, a great combination of perspectives on the issue. I really appreciate it. I think from the GEC's perspective, we are in a global competition with foreign adversaries who are engaged in disinformation and propaganda in a multimodal way. So we are affected by disinformation and propaganda through multiple technologies and platforms. And so as a result, we need to be quick to understand all of those modes and to find the solutions that help us get ahead of their adversarial use of disinformation and propaganda, really in as close to real time as possible. To do that, we've set up a number of programs. Leah Bray, the deputy coordinator of the GEC, gave a good overview of our tech challenges. Another program that I think is very interesting to everybody watching this would be our technology program, our test bed, which is the opportunity for our partners to test out new technologies in this space to find rapid solutions and again get ahead of the adversary before we've lost the battle, the propaganda or disinformation battle. And so we're looking at a broad array of technologies. I think for the last 5 years, people in this community have been focused, of course, on understanding where the problem is. You know, how do we use data analytics and social listening to understand where the adversary is active? That's absolutely essential, and it'll continue. But there's also a broader array of technologies that are out there that are potentially very powerful to counter disinformation propaganda. You know, whether it's gamification, which is a form of media literacy, or if it's content validation, such as blockchain-based content validation, or whether it's crowdsourced assessment of journalistic standards. You know, these are all new technologies that are coming online and are potentially very powerful against the problem at a tactical level. And we're really happy to have essentially gone through about, I think we're at 26 different tests of technologies at this point, and we've implemented about a third of those. So we're in a great place for that. And critical to doing this is integrating civil society, integrating academia, and of course, industry at every point along the way. So we are dependent on our industry partners really to lead the development of these new technologies and to get us to a place where we're actively defending against foreign propaganda and disinformation. So, you know, we're pleased with that, and we'll be happy to work with everybody who's on the line to push that forward. Thanks.
One of the problems that tech solutions try to address is the problem of scale. There is just so much information online coming from all sources that it can be hard for human analysts to detect trends and synthesize patterns quickly at the scale at which information travels in 2021. Allan, I wanted to turn to you as a practitioner in this space that leads a team of researchers. How do you integrate technologies and tools into your workflows, and what have you found most useful and what have you found most lacking?
Thanks, Zareen. So I'm glad to be part of this amazing panel, and thank you for the invitation. In terms of the tools and what we find most useful, one thing that we've been trying to do is, of course, the tool that you use is tailored on the project that you're doing. So one of the two main categories of tools that we mainly use and find mostly useful are ones that deal with social media monitoring and analysis. And also the other thing is, of course, media monitoring, because we've seen a number of disinformation actors have now moved from actually spreading the disinformation on social media itself, but kind of redirecting users to other websites, blogs, which basically is captured through through like media monitoring tools. The thing that probably I would like to note is that most of the tools that we try to use to investigate disinformation are actually not tailored for disinformation, but rather for PR and marketing. So you'll find a social media analysis tool, which has been actually built to support marketing efforts, the ones that we actually use for investigations. And that would mean that at the end of the day, the tools themselves don't have some of the features that we as researchers or investigators would like them to have, yeah? So that's one of the things. The other thing that I've found in the last 5 years that has been really helpful is these tools have now started employing machine learning like technologies like NLP and sentiment analysis, which get to give us a couple of insights when we're doing our investigations or our research. Open source technology is a lot. Most of the PR and marketing tools that I'm talking about, of course, are commercial. So you get to have to like access to Twitter, to Facebook, and that way you're able to have visibility on all the indicators. And another thing that I probably like to highlight in terms of limitations of the solutions that we've seen One thing is that they try to eliminate the human element at the end of the day, which is really important when it comes to research and investigations. So I think the other thing is also they try to, as one of the panelists, Evanna has said, being the all-in-one stop shop. Like you want to counter to be the only source or provider or tech solution to counter the entire disinformation sphere, which is kind of a very, which will involve a lot of effort and a lot of research and a lot of course, budget for you to create such kind of a solution. So I would probably say as users, that's one of the other things. The other thing is, of course, at the end of the day, customization of the tools themselves to meet the demands or the demands of the researchers or like the use cases of the researchers across the globe. One thing that we found, particularly in Africa, is that some of the tools that are developed don't address or don't have sources, like for example, when it comes to media monitoring, they don't have sources that are tailored to Africa. So probably we are missing some of the data sets that will be really critical to get an informed decision from the data that you're reviewing. And also the other thing is the language capabilities. So in Africa, we do have like 2,000 languages. And that means that the NLP and the sentiment analysis will probably understand only English, French, and a couple of more languages in Africa. So that's one of the things that we've highlighted. And even in the recent Ethiopia election, most of the content that we're monitoring were actually in Amharic, which posed a very huge challenge because the tools we are using are customized to only understand English, to only understand French, and all these other major languages. Thanks.
You've highlighted several challenges, I think, on the part of that researchers actually face when they use those tools. One of the big ones that you mentioned is that a lot of the tools that disinformation researchers use aren't actually meant for their use case. Some of the most robust social media monitoring tools are meant for digital marketing. So I think researchers have to get creative, and you highlighted that, as well as the limited language capabilities of some of these tools. A lot of the focus on tools design is often on text-based, on synthesizing patterns and text-based information. But there's also a space for development focused on visual media, which is a significant part of many disinformation campaigns. I want to turn to Sam Gregory now. Sam, could you give us sort of a summary of the evolutions in the emerging technologies to synthesize patterns in visual media manipulation?
Thank you. Yes, and delighted to be here to join this conversation. So visual misinformation, there's, as you note, been a heavy focus on text-based misinformation, and visual information provides both much more rich information to analyze if we're trying to approach it from an AI or machine learning perspective, but also a range of challenges. And I would say, as I look back at the last 5 years of how we track misinformation and at Witness, we obviously have an interest in both how do you gather truthful information, and there's been a lot of the work in the human rights sector to develop tools to help people assert the validity of their information in a climate of mis and disinformation. And there's also been this development of tools to track visual mis and disinformation. It strikes me that the tools that people have used most in a practical sense have actually been the very simple tools developed often with human rights users, civil society in mind. So I think a lot around, very basic tools for reverse image search, like you find in something like the InVid tool, or in fact, something that Amnesty developed 5 or 6 years ago, the YouTube data viewer. And again, what they're trying to do is something similar to what Allan has been describing, is give us the opportunity to track source of videos and place it in the context of that source, the history of a source image. A lot of my work in the last 3 years has come from a Witness perspective and thinking about new forms of visual misinformation and disinformation, such as deepfakes that are emerging and are progressing very fast technically. And I think we're seeing there again, how do we develop tools that are effective for the types of scenarios that we see in a diverse set of more localized context. And I think that's often the perspective when I look at these tools, is to say, will this be valuable to someone who's in a kind of community level mis and disinfo medic type approach? They're trying to counteract things in near real time. And it's in those contexts that the most accessible tools now are things like reverse image search, those very simple contextualization tools. The tools that are inaccessible, and this is also for the technical reasons that we were talking about earlier, are the types of image analysis tools for kind of sorting the needle in the haystack, doing that triage work. And as we look at the gaps in the space right now, we're particularly centered on how do you think about better community level tools that are really centered on the needs of community leaders, human rights defenders. And I think, and I hope to talk more about this later, that the deepfake space really provides us a really great almost case study of how do we understand threats and solutions and how do we align those as we start to look at an emerging area of visual mis and disinformation.
That's a really interesting point about accessibility. And with the proliferation of for-profit, some of these more for-profit solutions and technical tools that rely on machine learning and AI to synthesize, to extract patterns from a large corpus of data. One of the problems is that there are barriers to entry. First of all, there's often a cost barrier. These tools are too expensive because they have to secure API access from various platforms, as well as make a profit off of that. On top of that, they're not really accessible to the people that they are meant to help. So Evanna, I wanted to turn to you to talk to us a little bit about what is the role of for-profit companies in this space and designing these solutions?
That's a great question. I would actually have to disagree with something that you just said, which is the price. I don't think pricing is ultimately the problem. I think it's the access to the social media API. Like, how many people actually have access to Twitter Firehose? 5 or 6 companies, right? And they might be selling their products for a lot of money, but for a lot of other people, it's not the pricing. I think, the reason why there are for-profit companies is because there is a marketplace for this, where else no one would actually buy it. That's just capitalism. And one of the things that as a for-profit company that we can do is we can do a lot of the R&D work in computational propaganda that otherwise would not get done by civic society organizations, or just organizations that are supported by donor agencies like USAID. I can guarantee you that if you actually want to write a proposal to USAID saying, I would like to use your money for R&D, they'd be like, no, I don't think you can even find a budget line for that, right? So I think we do take on a lot of the risks, and our investors take on a lot of the risks in the very beginning too. And as long as there's a marketplace and there's demand, then there's a place for for-profit companies. We at Omelas have also considered actually spinning out a nonprofit sector and actually open sourcing a lot of our data sets. We do work with think tanks, we do work with a lot of other nonprofits, and we give it to them either for free. We're at like 90% discount, and that is only to cover the cost of AWS, GovCloud, and a lot of the storage that we have.
That's really interesting, the point about that you have been considering open sourcing some of your data sets. And one of the things that can be difficult with assessing the rigor of various tools is the fact that for-profit solutions will often use proprietary approaches. And this is a field whose heart is really in transparency and the fact that researchers can show their work. So how, Evanna, would you say, what is the best way to assess the quality and rigor of various tools, given that we may not necessarily have access to how they collect data, how they synthesize the huge
I think
amount
collecting
of data
data is, so collecting data, raw data, I think that for most people, that's a proprietary mean, but that's only because we're terrified that we're going to get cut off by the big social media companies, right? I actually think when it comes to data analytics, when we're working with our US government customers, we have to be transparent, because there's this notion that AI is a black box and the end users actually won't even buy or adopt what you have built until they feel comfortable enough. And so we have to actually be really transparent. And so I think that's something that most people don't think about, which is that ultimately we're still catering to a set of end users who are, no offense to JD, because he's definitely an exception, but for most of them are not tech savvy, right? And so they're like, well, how can I trust this if I don't know it? And my question is always like, well, you use Uber, right? But you don't need to know how they do their route optimization. But even though we kind of push back on that, we still have to be really transparent on like, this is how it works. Here are the data sets that we're taking in. This is our method of getting to the analysis. And a lot of times they compare that to the ground truth, or as close to the ground truth as possible to make sure that it's actually accurate. So transparency is actually built in with the analysis portion.
Thank you. Sam, I wanted to turn to you to talk a little bit more about the case study of deepfake detection and how that technology has evolved.
Thank you. Yes. So for a little bit of context, and I think this goes to how we think about design on these technologies and how we set expectations. So for the last 3 years at Witness, we've been trying to follow what we call a prepare, don't panic approach to deepfakes. I want to emphasize, I don't think deepfakes are the most prevalent form of visual mis and disinformation now. And when they're used, it's primarily in gender-based violence. But as we look at the tech trends on something like deepfake synthesis, so the ability to create deepfakes, we see the way in which these will plug into visual mis and disinformation trends. So over the last 3 years, we ran a process of consultation with people with lived and professional experiences around how current trends happen in mis and disinformation in sub-Saharan Africa and Brazil, Southeast Asia, the US, Europe, trying to really ask people what they wanted in terms of how they understood threats and what they understood as solutions. And one of the things we heard consistently about solutions was we want detection solutions that are cheap and accessible and not a luxury good, and that are also explainable in the circumstances we work in. And I think they meant both explainability in the AI sense, right? How do we understand the algorithm? But also explainability, so it's not this black box of, yes, I just told you this is not true when it looks real. We do hear a lot of people saying, look, we don't trust proprietary solutions, we don't trust the data behind them. And I think that's legitimate given what we've even seen on some of these deepfake detection solutions, which they're not accurate, for example, on certain skin tones in terms of their detection. They're biased because of the data algorithm biases we know very well. But I wanted to share a case study that I think really pulls together some of the threads around the challenges in these tools and accessibility. So I just wrote about this actually in an op-ed in Wired today. It was a case study from Myanmar that took place in March. A video came out that appeared to show a confession by a senior politician around corruption involving another senior politician. And what was interesting about this case is generally I wouldn't trust a video that emerges from a military coup government with someone creating this kind of claim. But what happened was a lot of people said this must be a deepfake. And they plugged it into the types of detectors that people have available for these now, which are primarily online detectors. You just stick in the video and it gives you a result. And in this case, the result that came back said that this video of this politician was 90% likely a deepfake. And people were suspicious because the face looked glitchy and all these things. Now, the problem, as it turns out, and I spent some time looking into the case to try and understand whether this really was a deepfake or much more likely, a type of forced confession you see under military governments. and with other researchers looked at the case. The problem was that deepfake detection tools they're glitchy. You have to know how to use them. They work only on specific methods, right? They're not designed for, one type of creation tool when you apply it to another. They don't work well on compressed video, which is what most of us experience most of our lives, like video that's been laundered through social media. But the panic that was created by people using a tool without knowing how it worked was quite significant. People like, they're deep faking these confessions. How do we understand it? And so it crystallizes together one of the problems, which is tools out there that people don't know how to use, or that are not well designed for particular context or well explained, can be extremely damaging. And I think that's one of the challenges we have, is making sure that we pair up tools with skills. Because one of the other challenges we saw in this case was that journalists and civil society in Myanmar didn't have the skills in media forensics. And I think one of the gaps we've been seeing from a lot of our work over the last years is actually a gap around media forensics. It's how do people really understand how to understand a piece of media to apply tools to it. And so we saw in this case in Myanmar, and we still don't know for certain whether it is a deep fake or not, though the balance of probabilities suggests not, how the combination of tools that were not very well designed for a real world scenario, that gave results that are confusing to a general public that doesn't understand how to use them, and weren't available to the key journalists to use with the right training, sets us up in a really difficult situation. And so I think it's really incumbent on us now to think very much about that sort of complementarity, consultation to discover what people need, co-design, and then really think about, as we build the tools, how do you make them available in open source variants with the right capacities around them and the right abilities to escalate things. I think that's really important. We heard as well in a lot of our consultations is not everyone's going to be a media forensics expert or a visual mis and disinformation. So how do we actually create much better mechanisms to escalate to people who have better technical competencies?
That's a good point about what happens when these tools are either adopted by bad actors or misinterpreted by people that do not necessarily know how to interpret them. And JD, I wanted to ask you, what is the role of, how do you explain how to interpret the results of some of these tools to people that are not necessarily as tech savvy, for example, perhaps in government or really across sectors?
Yeah, it's as Evanna pointed out, it can be pretty tricky to get the message across about the utility of some tools. I think, like I said early on, people in this community are fairly familiar with the idea of data analytics and being able to find where the adversary is active in the information environment. But again, there's a whole new set of tools out there that are coming online or are already online that are very, very useful to us and that we need to put to use. And it can be very difficult to explain these to the end user. Sometimes people don't really know what question to ask. And so we're in this position as the Global Engagement Center. We're really pushing the envelope. We're really at this bleeding edge of technology testing and technology implementation. And one of the challenges, yes, is to get that message back into the US government, but also to work with our industry partners to essentially socialize that information very broadly within their networks. So what we have set up is essentially a feedback mechanism. Every time we conduct a test of a technology, we are very actively pushing that information back into the US government, but also much more broadly. And we're attempting to get third-party analysis of the results of those tests. I think a great example of this would be our release this year of Harmony Square, which is a game, an online game intended to counter the effects of disinformation among the users. And we released this back in November, and now in English, and now I believe it's in at least 6 languages, maybe more. And the user base is growing and growing. And we invited Cambridge University to come in and take a look at it and make sure that it was doing what it is intended to do. And indeed, they did assess that it quantifiably does help the user of the game to defend themselves against the effects of disinformation and propaganda. It just takes the user through the process of developing out a disinformation campaign to disrupt the harmony on a town square. And it's all very tongue-in-cheek, but it works very well. But that process of working with industry to develop the game, working with academia to test out and verify the utility of the game, and then pushing that back into the community and into media has been essential to the success of that game. So I think that's probably a good example.
Allan, what sorts of creative solutions has your team devised and actually built that were because you thought they were missing on the current market?
Yeah, so I think for my team, I think what we realized, and probably I just want to highlight what JD has just mentioned, is, of course, what we've realized is human rights like organizations and civil societies like Code for Africa notice that disinformation tracking does not really need someone probably might need additional capabilities, and that is where we engage people like data analysts and technologists who review the technology that we have and tell us, okay, this technology will be able to give you this kind of results. But at the end of the day, that is never enough because we are using tools that probably have been customized for a particular use case. And I think some of the tools that we've had to actually manually create ourselves. So I would say hashtag analysis on Twitter is one of the prime areas. And one of the things that we've struggled with the most is getting alerts on, for example, hashtags within different countries, within different jurisdictions that are starting to crop up. So just recently is when the alerts feature have been implemented in most of our social media monitoring, but we found that to be quite a challenge. So what we did is, of course, went to Python, started playing around with Twitter API and tried to figure out whenever a hashtag is trending on a daily basis, how do you get that notification? So what we tried to do is, of course, at the end of the day, there's a scraper that looks at Twitter data and all the trends that have been happening all throughout that day. And now, of course, because the researcher will not be sitting there looking at Twitter hashtags every single time, they will be able to just review those hashtags and look at those that are suspicious. So that is kind of one of the ways we've had to do that. The other thing is probably when it comes to media monitoring. I think at Code for Africa, because media monitoring has been a key part of our research process, we realized, of course, the sources and the lack of data from Africanized sources. So what we did is we started building a different version of Media Cloud's media monitoring tool focused only on African data. So ingesting media articles and media sources from all the African countries. And because we are actually on the ground and our researchers are in across like 22 African countries, it's easier for us to pinpoint within these countries, these are all the media sources we should be ingesting. And that way we are able to, at the end of the day, only target sources that we are really particularly interested in for all the disinformation, counter-disinformation efforts that we do.
One of the hardest parts of relying on a tech-centered approach is that sometimes if certain tools don't acknowledge their limitations, media that reports on their results can sometimes misinterpret some of the methodological limitations. For example, you see headlines sometimes like 60% of accounts that are tweeting about, I don't know, the pandemic are bots. You're relying on bot detection technologies. I want to, again, go back to Sam. We see what do we see with regard to reporting deepfake detection, and how well does the public and media understand current capabilities?
Yeah, no, I think I'm glad we've picked up this point around, how we translate the results of technology, because I think it's really important. And the Myanmar case study I was sharing earlier was a really good example there of how you need to have technical literacy on the part of both OSINT type investigators in reporting teams, but also actually more generally in reporting teams, because in that case, many of the reporters really picked up quite uncritically this result. There was sort of a red box around the politician's face in this video that was shared that said 90% probability it's a deepfake. And underlying that, you have to layer in and say, wait a second, that's probably an erroneous result, because you need to understand that deepfakes detection technologies are generally not generalizable across different formats. They don't work well on compressed videos, all of these questions. And I think we also have to understand how we report on technology also plays into fears. So I think, deepfakes are a classic example of kind of this idea of either we don't know how to detect them, which is one sort of descriptive trope around them, like all our technologies are fail, we're surrounded by fakes, which is completely untrue. And that's a reflection of technical literacy on reporting that goes to the hype side. Or the other is when we genuinely do have cases, we don't have enough literacy to report and say, look, we know that deepfake detection technologies, say from the recent challenge that Facebook led, that the leading algorithm had about a 65% detection rate on deepfakes. That's not great. We should be using this as a data point, and then you should be showing your work in terms of reporting to explain it. And I think this is really important with all technologies, and in this community, we know this well, is you need to sort of show your work of how you complement the technological results with human judgment. So explaining, well, there's rationally and logically, we should interpret this result in this way as we move forward. So as I say, deepfakes is a classic example of both the hype cycle around technology that leads people to be skeptical of things they shouldn't, for example. And then the second part of it, of course, is that we need this literacy both at the OSINT journalist level, but frankly, increasingly at a generalist level in journalism to be able to report accurately on these types of tools.
Thanks. Yes, it's an important point to think about, not only designing tools, but how to communicate their use and results to the public. We have a few questions from the audience. This one is for Evanna. I'm curious on the arms race we are already in to avoid where better detection results. One second. How do we get out of this cycle? The question is about the arms race in detection technology, and how do we get out of this arms race in which counter-disinformation technologists are constantly developing tools to detect campaigns, and the content is becoming more sophisticated and better able to avoid detection?
I think there are two answers to that, or two-part answer. The first part is we need to start working with other players in this space in terms of making sure that what we're providing is the most comprehensive data. So for example, my company, we're really focused on overt IO detection. And often we'll work with other companies that are looking at the dark web or some of more of the covert means, right? So that we can actually package it together. So I do think there needs to be a lot more collaboration. But the second part of that is we get out of the arms race by actually being a little bit more focused on how do we actually respond, right? There are so many people who are doing detection, but there are very few companies and NGOs are actually working on the strategic communication campaigns to either respond to it or saying, hey, the reason why people are falling for disinformation is because of civic education and things and media literacy. So why don't we actually focus on the root of the problem as well? I think that's just another way of kind of distinguishing yourself from this oversaturated field of detection.
That's a good point. And Sam, I wanted to get your thoughts as well on that, because I know you've done some work on that with regard to deepfakes and visual media.
Yeah, so definitely, you know, and the arms race metaphor is used a lot in the deepfakes world of kind of the contest of developing, you know, algorithms to create deepfakes and the ability to detect them. And I think it's, you know, it's valid to describe that, and also valid to recognize there's a technical reality underlying that. We should also, you know, understand that, you know, where we sort of place our bets in any type of sort of mis and disinformation, we should reflect the underlying technical realities. And so in the case of deepfakes, you know, the trend is to make better and better deepfakes, and the detection will get more complicated over time. And so I think we have to recognize those dynamics, and what that's meant in the visual mis and disinformation spaces. You know, we're also seeing a lot of investment in for example, provenance architecture, so ways you can show how media has moved over time. And you know, examples of that are things like the Content Authenticity Initiative and the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And those are big industry initiatives. And I think that brings us back to another point when we think about technology and its particularly how it applies to civil society actors globally. Is there you have a big set of infrastructure and standards being built for what's known as authenticity provenance, which is, you know, tracking where a piece of media comes from, how it's been manipulated over time. And that's probably in the long run one of our strongest measures for dealing with visual mis and disinformation, is be able to understand better how media is manipulated over time. But the real key question is whose voices are represented in that type of infrastructure building. And I actually think when we look at civil society, often we come to this discussion way too late, right? Human rights groups are consulted once the product is in market, once the underlying infrastructure has actually been built and the standards have been set, and have very practical considerations of usages globally being integrated, have freedom of expression and privacy being central to it. And so this has been one area where Witness has been very involved in actually trying to be deeply involved in the standards building around these authenticity infrastructure to try and ensure that things we know could be problematic for, you know, global civil society and human rights are integrated early. You know, for example, not insisting on identity around a piece of media when you track the provenance in it, because we know the risks to citizen journalists. But I think the big point there is actually for technology, we actually need civil society at the table for the infrastructure and standards side before we even get to the tools side and the algorithm side and the implementation.
Can I add something just onto what Sam said?
Definitely.
Okay, great. I 100% agree with that. I think one of the biggest frustrations is, you know, in this space, like we all have very different definitions of what influence operations are, what disinformation is, what is malinformation, what is misinformation, right? And so once we actually have the standards, not only on like things like algorithms and regulations around what is actually considered personally identifiable information and all these things, it's going to help us. But even more from like a meta perspective of like, if we can actually just agree on what each term actually means, I think that would go a long way in helping everyone in the space, not just, you know, for-profit companies, but also civil society works.
That's a great point, and it leads me to my next question. I'm going to ask JD, how do we agree on definitions, right? Before we start designing technology, how do we agree on these definitions across sectors?
Yeah, I think, you know, this is a discussion that's been going on for pretty much a decade now. You know, how do we define disinformation, misinformation, malinformation? I think that you're not going to be able to define it substantively, right? You're not going to ever be able to come to grips with the idea of, you know, what is politically accurate information. Instead, you can make a decision about what is technically authentic information. And that's the direction that most of the social media platforms have gone when they've attempted to conduct content moderation or other actions against disinformation online. I think it's a very complex problem. And, you know, for the U.S. government, we certainly are not in the business of judging truth from fiction online. Instead, again, we're looking for inauthenticity and making sure that our adversaries are not you know, using those tactics against us.
And what happens when adversaries use some of these tools against us? Thinking about, focusing on, for example, foreign disinformation campaigns in particular, are there cases, JD, where like we know that a state adversary has used some sort of like social media monitoring tool for launching disinformation campaigns rather than countering them?
Off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of an individual case where social media monitoring was used itself for disinformation as a technological tool. But I think that in terms of responses to all of these, we are, over time, the Global Engagement Center has shifted its focus from, that sort of tit for tat counter disinformation messaging effort over to really a whole of society effort where we're attempting to integrate, yes, those narrative solutions, but also bringing in, industry where it's appropriate, social media platforms where it's appropriate to do what they are legally and ethically capable of doing. Also, bringing in that broad array of government capabilities, whether it's FBI conducting arrests or Treasury conducting sanctions or DOD doing show of force things like that. So we're really focusing on responses in a different way. And I think Evanna is right that we can't simply sit back and monitor, but we have to position ourselves where we are actively pushing the message and making sure that we have control over the narrative and we're not in constant response mode. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Allan, we have a question from the audience that I would really like to ask you. What do you have any tips for researchers on how to evaluate various OSINT tools that you use in your day-to-day investigations?
Yes, so I think one of the things that, of course, you need to test out is the accessibility of data of that particular tool. And one of the things that I also think many researchers and investigators fail to do is to actually audit the features of that particular tool. So you do push out a report saying that attributing a particular piece of disinformation content to an institution, an organization, or an individual, and yet you haven't, and that is just based on what the tool is telling you. So that's one of the things that researchers actually fail to do. So kind of the tips on how we do evaluation is, number one, look at what kind of data sources does this tool have? How much does it pull, and is it complete information? You can probably test it out or corroborate the information you're getting from one tool with another tool with the same capabilities. That way you're able to see that, okay, and I think you probably for commercial tool, it's impossible to do that because you need that priority access where you're given by the vendor. But I think for OSINT tools that is possible, and we have very many tools that do the same functionality. So just doing that corroboration between two different tools or three different tools on the results of what you're getting could be really important.
Thank you for that. We have about 1 minute and 30 seconds left, and I wanted to ask as a last question, each of you, if you could design if you could solve one design problem, what would it be in tools development in this space? Evanna, let's start with you.
Interoperability. So I want all the tools to actually have an API, RESTful API that can actually be used.
We mentioned that at the beginning. And JD?
I think it's somewhat similar to that answer. It's simply that we have an array of tools that are now available, and unfortunately, policymakers and users are only thinking about them singularly, and we really need to be able to bring these tools together and try to use as many of them as possible to face the multimodality of the disinformation problem.
Thank you. Sam, over to you.
in fact, investment in skills around tools, so a much more diverse investment in skills to support a greater range of people to use these tools.
It's an important one. And Allan?
As a user, I don't think I would have that design perspective, but I think investment into how we need to look at now the encrypted messaging platforms would really be a really interesting space for us to like invest in the near future. So yeah.
It's a great point to end on. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this panel, Evanna, Sam, JD, and Allan, and thank you to the audience for listening. We really have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of tools development, but all of the points you raised are really, really important. And I'm going to turn it now to my colleague, Rose, to introduce the next panel.